Hi, Chad, Versamatic. Today we're going to install an air-in kit into our E4 non-metallic metallic center pump. Out front we have examples of Versamatic genuine parts in the form of air-in kit and a wet-in kit. The rebuild you're going to see is accurate in man-method machine, but for video purposes, some parts of the work performed have been condensed in time. At any point during the presentation, please pause this video until you have completed any part of the process. The pump we are using in this presentation has been built new and is considerably easier to work with than a pump that has been used in a process. Additional time may be required in the preparation and separation of parts and components during the rebuild. Identifying which kit is required for your repair has become easier on newer pumps with the metal serial number tag that now indicates the wet end and air in kit information for the pump. Kit information can also be found in the service and operating manual. Versamatic genuine replacement parts, wet end and air in kits provide a bill of material of the components included in the kit. All items included in the kits are components that Versamatic recommends replacing when rebuilding a pump. The pump we are using today is an example of the ease of installation. Always consult your respective service and operating manual before performing any maintenance on your pump. Service and operating manuals include composite repair parts drawings, repair parts list, and torque specifications. Our airside video today will include the following items: gasket, O-rings, and spacers. These are the recommended tools used with the rebuild. While the sizes may change based on the model, the type will remain the same. Torque wrench, ratchet, breaker bar, O-ring pick, sockets and/or wrenches, 1/2 inch, 1¼ inch 6-point socket, 5/32 inch socket head Allen wrench. Alright, let's get started. Today we're going to use a 3/8 drive impact gun for ease of disassembly and reassembly. First we're going to start off by removing our discharge manifold. Set aside the discharge manifold. Remove valve seats and check balls. Now remove the suction manifold. Set aside suction manifold. Remove valve seats and check balls. Now remove one outer chamber. Once we remove all outer chamber bolts, set aside the outer chamber for later reassembly. Remove the second outer chamber and set aside. Now remove the diaphragm assemblies. One diaphragm assembly will contain outer plate, diaphragm, and inner plate. The second diaphragm assembly will contain the main shaft. Now remove the main air valve from the center section of the pump. Set aside the main air valve for disassembly. Now we'll remove the pilot valve assembly, holding one side with a 1/2 inch wrench, and use our impact gun to remove the opposite side. Remove the retaining plate that holds our pilot assembly in on one side. Repeat this process for the opposite side. Here we're going to install the lock nut back on to one side. This will help pull the stack up of the pilot assembly through the center section of the pump. Remove the lock nut. Remove the old pilot assembly stack up. Now remove the main shaft O-ring out of the brass bushing. Repeat this process for the opposite side. Now we're ready to install our air-in kit. Inspect the pilot shaft for any scarring or scratching or damage and replace as needed. Go ahead and install a lock nut on one end of the pilot shaft. Start off with the brass spacer. O-ring. And pilot spacer. From there on out, it's O-ring, spacer, O-ring, spacer, until all O-rings and spacers are installed. Apply light grease to all O-rings on the pilot. Apply light grease to the pilot bore. This helps ensure that we don't roll, nick, or damage any of the O-rings upon reassembly. Go ahead and install our valve retainer plate and lock nut on one end. Gently press in the pilot stack up into the pilot bore. Now we're ready to install our valve retainer plate on the opposite side. Thread in and tighten our cap screw that holds the valve retainer plate to the center section of the pump. Repeat this process for the opposite side. Now we're ready to tighten the lock nuts on both ends of the pilot shaft. There is no torque value for these lock nuts. Apply light grease to the main shaft bushing. Install the main shaft O-ring into the brass bushing. Be sure to fully seat the main shaft O-ring into the brass bushing. Repeat this process for the opposite side. Now we're going to rebuild our air valve assembly. Start by removing the end cap. And our end cap gasket also. Now remove the second end cap and end cap gasket. Push the spool out from one end. Remove the glide ring assemblies using an O-ring pick. Underneath the glide ring itself is an O-ring. Inspect the spool for any scarring or scratching or damage. Replace as needed. Now install the glide ring assembly, which includes the O-ring and glide ring that goes over top of the O-ring. Inspect the integrity of the casting. Inspect the brass sleeve for any scarring or scratching or damage. Now install the main air valve spool, gently compressing the glide ring assemblies as you insert the main air valve spool into the brass sleeve. Install our new End Cap Gasket. Be sure to align all the bolt holes and pilot porting hole. Repeat this process for the second side. Now align our main air valve gasket, aligning the bolt holes and the pilot porting holes. Be sure to align these bolt holes to the center block of the pump. Then torque the air valve assembly to the recommendations called out in the service and operating manual. Apply light grease to the main shaft so we don't scar or scratch or damage the main shaft O-ring upon reassembly. Slide the diaphragm rod into the center of the pump. Now we're ready to install our opposite diaphragm assembly. Note the part numbers and material codes on the diaphragm itself. Install the diaphragm outer plate with the radius facing towards the diaphragm. Same thing on the inner plate. Install the inner diaphragm plate radius towards the diaphragm. When tightening the diaphragm assembly to the rod, be sure to torque both diaphragm assemblies to factory specification. Now install our outer chamber. Inspect the outer chamber for casting integrity. Inspect the machine surfaces and radius of the chamber for damage or material buildup. Scarring, scratching, or material buildup can be cleaned up using emery paper, crocus cloth, or fine sandpaper. Note the orientation of the outer chamber, the arrow facing up. Be sure to align the diaphragm into the groove of the outer chamber. Note the orientation of the air valve on the side of the pump and the outer chamber facing up. Thread in and bring all bolts snug in a cross pattern and torque to factory specifications. Once you have one outer chamber installed, shift across the opposite diaphragm assembly. Inspect the second outer chamber machine surfaces, the radius, nice round radius for the diaphragm to roll across. Inspect the integrity of the casting. Inspect the machine surface on the discharge side and suction side. Inspect the ball cages. Note the orientation of the outer chamber facing up and the air valve on the side of the pump. Begin to install all the outer chamber hardware. Once you have all the outer chamber bolts installed, tighten the outer chamber bolts in a cross pattern and torque to factory specifications. Now we're ready to install our suction check balls and valve seats. Note the orientation of the valve seat. Inspect the integrity of the suction manifold, the machine surfaces. Orientation of the manifold is based on process requirements and may be reinstalled in either direction. Be sure to hand tighten in all bolts on the suction manifold and torque in a cross pattern to factory specifications. Now we're going to install our discharge check balls and valve seats. Note the orientation of the check ball to the valve seat. Inspect the machine surfaces of our discharge manifold, nice clean sealing surface. Inspect the ball cages for any sharp edges. Orientation of the manifold is based on process requirements and may be reinstalled in either direction. Tighten the bolts down evenly and torque in a cross pattern to factory specifications.